All right, good morning, everyone. Today we're going to talk about server-side APIs. In today's lecture, our end state will be to create a Django API endpoint that interacts with a third-party server-side API to forward responses to our client. And the important thing here is we're going to forward responses to our client. So essentially, our server is going to work kind of like as a connecting file between a separate server that's running a separate API and our client. The highlights for today will be utilizing requests to make API requests with Python, and then utilizing OAuth 1 to authenticate with API services. In part one of our lecture, we'll cover why server-side APIs, exploring API documentation, creating an API app, utilizing requests, utilizing OAuth 1 for authentication, and handling secrets within your applications. Does anyone have any questions over what we'll cover here in part one? All right, awesome. There aren't any questions. Let's quickly do a quick overview of what we've seen within our Django server so far. So within our Django server so far, we've seen where a user would send in a request. It would be processed by our backend URL patterns. Our settings.py would become loaded. From there, our URL patterns would connect us to the appropriate application. The application URLs will connect us to the appropriate views. That view may be serving as a model view controller, where the view interacts with a serializer and the serializer interacts with the model. Or it may just be running logic to formalize or generate server actions, logic to interact with third-party APIs to pull data and forward it to a user, or logic to generate reports to a client. Right? One of them is specifically to interact with the models. The other one is specifically to generate data content and run logic for a client. All right. Then we have our model serializers, which are model serializers take query sets and turn them into JSON data. Those specifically interact with our model. Our models have relationships and validators interacting within them, validators acting as constraints, and relationships to make our database more dynamic. All of our models are a direct reflection of database tables inside of PostgreSQL. As we query information in Python, that turns into SQL data through PsychoPG. That SQL data comes back with a data table that PsychoPG turns into a Python query set, and that gets fed to our serializer to generate JSON data. Finally, once we have some JSON data within our API view, that gets returned back to our project. Our project processes the request and returns a response to our front-end application. All right. Does anyone have any questions about our project or our server-side layout up to this point? Hmm. Okay, great. No one's has any questions. Let's go ahead and start working on our slide deck today. So, third-party APIs. Why third-party APIs? It's important to continue to utilize the dry and SRP. And in this case, we now want to add the work smarter, not harder. Right? So dry is don't repeat yourself, and then SRP is single responsibility principle. If there's an API that is running and holds the functionality we need, we can ping it with the proper information through our own API. All right. For example, let's say we want to generate some sort of function that would allow us to interact with banking data. Now, banking data can become very, very complicated, and we would have to get permissions to be able to interact with separate banks. Different banks would have to sign a bunch of things to allow us to actually have entry to their data. But there's already APIs out there that have done this entire process, went out to separate banks and signed all the legal schmeagle that they need to sign to be able to have access to data as long as a user consents to it. Well, now through our server, we can host their API, giving our clients the ability to see their banking data through our projects by just simply interacting with this third-party API. All right. Here's the way it works. Let's say that we want to utilize the noun project in this case. And the noun project is actually a really cool little fun icon project here. Let's say I look up Francisco. This is what it shows me. And the icons that come up for Francisco. We see the Golden State Bridge a couple of times. I don't even know what this is. I'm probably uneducated for not knowing what that is. There's this little guy, which I'm assuming is some sort of conquistador. Francisco de Quevedo icon. All right. Essentially, icons are provided for anything that we would want to search up. If I look up fork, there's a fork that shows up. If I look up something like Zeus, let's see that. We can see icons that show up for different nouns, right? Even if I run Adam, let's see what comes up for Adam. I haven't actually ran that one yet. Okay, I think we're getting like a Adam and Eve here showing up.
I'll take it. I'll take it.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of Adam and Eve actually. But all of these icons are provided by the site. Essentially, what we can do with this is connect our documentation or our API to be able to send a request to the noun project to grab these different icon URLs. So here's our example. Let's say your front end sends in a request saying, hey, I need a lamp image that interacts with our API. The request falls into our server and it says, hey, I want to grab a lamp image. Well, we don't have a lamp image inside of our database. And we're not going to start storing a bunch of images or different icons when all we're trying to do is provide users icons from the Noun project. Instead of creating new entries or stacking up all of our static files by creating new images, we're just going to simply send a request over to the Noun project saying, hey, I need a lamp. The Noun project will ping their own server. Their server will route that to the appropriate API view. They'll grab the image from their data and return to us an image URL that we can return to our client. Does anyone have any questions about how that forwarding process works? All right, doesn't look like we have any questions. So let's talk about how we're going to actually. Oh, I see a question. Go ahead, Alex.
Sorry. How does your backend server know that the noun project exists?
Got it. So the way the our server is going to know the noun project is going to exist is we're going to actually code a request that's going to take in the user input and send that request over to the noun project. Just like we utilize Axios to make requests over to our server, we're going to utilize requests to make a request to the noun project.
Got it.
All right. Awesome. So this is going to be the next slide here where we have request. Let's say our user gives us the variable of lamp that goes to my get image function, or sorry, my get image view that takes in the variable and it makes the request to the noun project with the appropriate variable there. Notice that we're utilizing the actual package of requests. So request is going to be something within Python, and it's essentially the equivalent of Axios for a Python code. All right, any questions? Doesn't look like we have any questions. Let's go ahead and take a look here. So here's the official documentation for the request. If you want to take a look at how this works, you definitely can. There's a lot of different capabilities that come with requests. You can see that it has passing parameters and URLs, response content. There's also some advanced usage for like session objects, client-side certifications. There's SSL certifications, um, header ordering. There's some really advanced topics that fall here. And then something that you should really become familiar with is going to be authentication. They have different types, basic authentication, OAuth, and so on. You can't expect your API documentation to always have a direct, hey, if you're using Python, this is how you're going to make a request. But by reading your API documentation, you can take a look at their authentication section and they're going to tell you, hey, we are running something like basic authentication. In which case, you could come over to your request, and even though their example may be in a completely different language, you can open up basic authentication. And here, it's going to walk you through the process of this is how we conduct basic authentication, right? And we can actually pass in what our basic authentication may look like and send in our request, depending on the basic authentication that they want. All right. Same thing. They have this digest authentication. I don't think I've ever seen that. Let me open it up just in case I actually have. Digest authentication. Yeah, I've never actually seen something like this, so that's cool. They have OAuth, and they walk you through the process of utilizing OAuth 1. They have OAuth 2 for OpenID connection. And here in OAuth 2, it knows that things can get a little bit more complicated. So it even gives you another drop-down menu of what you want. If you're working from a web application, a mobile application, something like a legacy application, or even a backend application flow. So let's take a look at that. Hmm. And it gives you some pretty detailed information. So backend application flow, here's the client ID, the client secret, how you should be authenticating with information, and then how to make the request later on. It goes through the process of refreshing tokens and so on. So a lot of information that goes into OAuth. You can't expect your API documentation to do all the work for you. Sometimes it just requires you to connect the dots, right? If your API documentation is telling you this is the type of authentication I'm running, just read the documentation within request, match it to the appropriate authentication method, and see what's in common between the two, between your API documentation and how request is processing information. All right, and then there's also the OAuth 1 website, where the OAuth 1 or OAuth 2 website will walk through the process of, hey, this is how we work with these different libraries. So depending on the stack that you're working with, you may be working within a C stack, something that has .NET and C Sharp. There's VB.NET, Go, JavaScript as well. So if you're making a JavaScript server inside of Node.js, you can still utilize OAuth as well. Right? And then here's all of our PHP and Python information. So for Python information, I can go ahead and take a look at OAuth lib. And here it's going to give me everything regarding Python and OAuth lib, how it works, how to install it, the different licensing, the predate OAuth 2. Here it gives me some read the docs information. And now it's nice and pretty as to how I could read the documentation regarding OAuth. All right. Does anyone have any questions over the different tools that we'll be utilizing to connect our server to a third-party API? All right. If no one has any questions, let's start diving into our actual API today. So here's the Now Project API. Hopefully everybody signed up for it yesterday because sometimes it does take a while to generate a user and be able to generate a valid token for you. So let's take a look here. I'm gonna come over to API. We can see it gives me this get started out icon. So now I'm within the different APIs that I have available. They do have a pricing portion. That's at some point you may hit some sort of limit. You can see that they have different apps. In this case, I'm going to create a new app here. So my application is going to be called Buffalo Platoon. And it is going to render different icons for Pokemon types. And then you can see that it gives me that generate API key portion. So now I'm within my application. I have my Buffalo platoon. I'm gonna come down. We can see the cumulative, the historical. This is just showing me every time I ping the API. And then it gives me some key management. So here I have some variables where this is my client key and this is my client secret key. I apologize. This is the API key and this is the client secret key. This grants me access to the API itself, and the secret key authenticates me as the user making the request. I can take a look at their documentation as well. Gonna go ahead and open that up. Under their documentation, they have this whole getting started section. They talk to me about how to create an API key, authentication methods. So let's take a look at that. Let's see. So for creating an API key, go into a non-project account, app management, generate a new API key. All right. So that gives me all the information I need there. I can go into authentication. Here's the API is secured with OAuth 1. So that gives me information as to what authentication I'll need. So I know I need OAuth 1. I can come over to OAuth 1 and take a look at how would, let's see, using the client, create a provider. All right, so here's request OAuth lib. So that's what I'm going to need to install, that looks like. And then it talks to me about how I could create a client here rather than just giving it the keys. It looks like I'm able to just create a client itself. That way I don't have to rewrite code. That's awesome. If I continue down here, it talks to me through the process of making requests. So author authenticated, you can make requests. To make a request, you simply need to make an endpoint. So here's the endpoint that I'll be working with. That's important for me to know. Um, Really important here are some supporting files and HTTP responses. It looks like we're going to get a 200 success, 404 not found, or 401 unauthorized. Now, the fact that these are the only three types of responses, it's a little disappointing. I would expect to have a couple of other types of responses, just to help me have a better interaction with the API. That's not uncommon, where essentially they try to minimize the amount of responses you may receive. That way, you can debug and have an easier experience with the documentation and the API itself. But as you'll learn, sometimes that does the exact opposite. It creates less of a friendly experience when interacting with APIs. All right, and then unacceptable uses. This part's pretty important. All right. So this includes, but is not limited to, distributing icons, reselling content, exploiting the noun project users or content, and replicating the noun project. So these are things that we cannot utilize this project for. And if we come down below, it looks like it even gives us some sample code as to how we can work with this. We have OAuth. We're utilizing our authentication there. It gives me my endpoint. And then it has some responses that I can work with. And here we can see that we can change the language. We can see things in C#. We can see things in PHP. And if you're working with Node.js, you can also see it within Node. All right. Let's see what else they have here. They have API documentation and they have an API Explorer. Well, that's cool. Let's open that up in the new tab. Let me take a look at this API Explorer. So here you can see that it's asking for my API key and my secret key. I can grab this from my application. So here's my API key. I'm gonna bring it over. I won't need that anymore. And now it's asking for my secret key, which again, I can copy it, paste it, and now I can take a look at a couple of icons. All right, let's see here. Looks like we have blacklist. There's icon where you're searching by ID. I wonder if there's a different way to take a look at icons here. Let's see what that looks like. So it's only accessing by ID. That's not necessarily what I want. Okay, so here it's actually accepting a query parameter. So v2 icon accepts a query. Again, if I say something like, I don't know, let's see a fork, and I click on try it out, it gives me an example as to how the request would be sent. And notice that it's directly returning to me an object where I have the key of icons that gives me an array of objects. In that array, within every object, I'll be able to find a thumbnail URL. All right, let's see if there's something else in here that I can use. Okay, again, it goes into the next one. We have a thumbnail URL and so on. So I'll always be able to find a thumbnail URL, and keep in mind, this is returning a list of queries, right? Or a list of objects. All right, so now I have the endpoint that I want to utilize. So here's my endpoint that I'm going to be utilizing. I have in my API documentation information as to how I'll be utilizing some sample code. So here's some sample code that I'll be making my request with. I have my endpoint, and it tells me how to pass in queries as well. All right, perfect. So now I can go ahead and actually start working with my noun project. Before we start diving into writing some code, does anyone have any questions about how we explored the noun project, the different resources that we found, and how maybe you should be exploring your APIs? Go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, I'll just second that because yes, a lot of these API calls, I don't know about other people's projects, but I've been doing some of my own research. But yeah, these requests, going between your like backends and then even to like API calls to like websites or databases that are on the internet. Yeah, this makes things a little bit easier to how we can actually do this in Postgres or not Postgres, Django.
Absolutely. Awesome. Go ahead, Tom.
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Excellent. Um, since we're creating our own app, is there a way for us to create our own secret key, etc., for authentication purposes?
Yes, there is. And we're gonna actually be doing that once we get to authentication in a future lecture.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Of course. All right. So now that we have our API running, let's go ahead, or now that we understand our API, let's go ahead and actually go into how we can create this application that will interact with the Now Project API and return some project code for us. So I'm gonna change directory into Poke API project. Here I'm gonna go ahead and install of my requirements. So pip install requirements txt, and I forgot the -r because why wouldn't I? All right, and there's all of my requirements that have been installed. Now I can run Python manage.py start app, and I'm just gonna call this API app. Now I'm naming this API app because this is going to be handling all API communications. All right, so it's not uncommon to see something like an API app or an integrations app to talk to all the different third-party APIs. And then comes to the different things that I'll need in order to run this code. Well, we already discussed that we're going to utilize requests. So I can pip install requests. And then we discussed that we will be utilizing something called request OAuth lib. All right, if we take a look at the documentation, here we can see request OAuth lib. So I can say pip install requests OAuth lib. And now request OAuth lib is also installed within my project. All right, let me use some Python virtual environment management here. So I'll say which Python 3. I'll copy this path here, and then run Command-Shift-P to enter my interpreter path. All right. Let's dive straight into our API views here. I'm going to create a urls.py or within my API app. From Django dot URLs, I will import path, create some URL patterns here. Where path, I'm always going to be looking for my variable. And I'm going to be tying this into my noun API view. Okay, now I can say from .views, I want to import noun API, which doesn't exist as of now. Here, everything's still going to remain the same. I'm going to say from REST framework .views, I want to import API view. From REST framework .response, I want to import response. From REST framework .status, I'm going to go ahead and import two status codes. I'm going to import HTTP 200 and HTTP 500, which stands for an internal server error. All right. So there's everything that I should need to actually be able to generate this response or this API view. I'm going to go ahead and make my class of noun API, where I'll be inheriting from API view. In this class of noun API, I'll have my client key, and I'll have my secret key. All right. Here I can make my method of get, which will take in self, request, and the variable that comes in from my URL endpoint. And for now, I can go ahead and return a response that will just hold my variable and the status code of HTTP 200. right? I'm not doing anything crazy yet. I'm not connecting to the actual API just yet. I'm just trying to make sure that my project is going to be connected to this noun project or this noun API view correctly. So I did everything within the app itself, but my project doesn't even know that this app exists. I need to go to the Poke API project, come down to settings, add it to my installed apps, say API app. I need to come over to my project URLs. Come down to my URL patterns and say path, which would be API/v1. And we can attach some sort of endpoint to this that we would want. We could name it attachments, we could name it images. In this case, I'm just going to name it noun. And I'm going to include API app.urls. All right, let's go ahead and run our server. My server is up and running. Here I see this home response. If I come over to our response here and I go to API/v1/Pokemon, you can see that all of our Pokemon from our database are still being processed. The ability to pass in an argument is still working. So nothing has broken just yet. If I go to v1/noun, when I get an error, it's telling me, well, you're asking for a noun, but we're not really seeing any sort of connection here. Well, it's because I haven't passed in my argument. Well, for noun, I want to see a fork. And now we get fork as our variable. So everything's connected to the right place, and our API view is ready to be developed. Does anyone have any questions over how we're creating a new app and connected this app to our project? All right, perfect. Since there aren't any questions, let's go ahead and develop this noun project API here. First, within my client key, I'm going to actually grab that key of my client. So let me open this up a little bit. Here's my client key. Here's my secret key. I guess this would be better if we named it API key. All right, so there's my API key and my secret key. I can come over to the documentation example that they show me, which is here. I know that I'll need to import requests. And I know that I'll need to import response, or excuse me, request OAuth lib. I need to import OAuth 1. All right. Well, now I'm going to actually make my request. I'm essentially going to take this exact code, where I'll say OAuth is going to take OAuth 1, and I'm creating an instance of the class of OAuth 1, where I'm passing in the API key. And I'll be passing in the secret key. Right? From there, I'll specify the endpoint, which I found earlier. So let me come over to this documentation here. Here's the endpoint that I want to utilize. So I'm going to copy it, create it into an F string, and paste it. And I'm just going to simply include this variable inside of this F string for my query. So I'll say variable. All right, so there's my endpoint. I come back over to the documentation. I'm up to this point here. Well, now I can actually generate my request. I can say response is equal to requests.get, where I'm going to pass in my endpoint and pass in my authentication. All right. Now it gives me this response.content. Yesterday, we also saw there was something like response.data. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and import JSON because I feel like I'm going to end up needing that at some point. Let's go ahead and print response.content and see what comes back from my application. All right, so here's my noun project fork. I'm going to open up my server so I can see that print statement. Let me come all the way to the bottom here. All right. I go ahead and send that request one more time. Notice how it took a little bit to process the request. And now in my print statement, I have this massive, it looks like a binary string, I want to say. Let me come over to the top here. Almost there. Maybe. All right, so this B and then quotation tells me that this is actually a binary string. So I'm receiving a response. And the content is there, which would be almost like the equivalent as response.data. It's just that response doesn't actually have a data attribute. I just have to load this object utilizing JSON. All right. And you would think, hey, well, I should be able to just run JSON, right? In this case, you won't be able to. Instead, I would ask you all to say data is equal to JSON.loads and then pass in response.content. And let's print out data now. We send our request one more time. If we scroll down to the bottom, well, now we don't have a binary string. We actually have our data coming straight in from the now project. Well, now it's as simple as giving the actual URL to a thumbnail to my fork object, or excuse me, to my response. Come back over to the noun project. Here they have a really nice layout of what it is I'm working with. I know that within data, I have the key of icon. Otherwise, I wanted to say no key present. Actually, let's just do the key of icon. Within the key of icon, I know that I also have an array. So I'm just going to grab the very first response or the very first object. And from that very first object, I'm going to go ahead and get this thumbnail URL. All right, so we get the key of icon. Let me just actually highlight it here. We grab the key of icon. From there, we're working with an array. So we grab index 0. That's going to give me the very first object. And within that very first object, I grab the key of thumbnail URL. And that's what I want to return to my user. Let's make sure that actually worked. I'm going to send the request again. Okay, so now I'm getting an error. It's telling me, hey, non-type object is non-subscriptable. Let's check it out where that came from. Okay, so data.get icon. It looks like icon is returning a non-type object. All right, and I see a hand up. Was that Arnold?
I think it's supposed to be icons.
Oh, let's check it out. Yeah, it is icons. Nice. All right, so we made a little quick error there. And by we, I mean me. I sent my request again. It was successful. We can see fork, and there I can see the actual image. Well, let's open that up. There's the image of a fork, all right? Well, now instead of just returning this variable, I can actually return my image. We can say selected image is equal to data.get, and we can just return the selected image. Now, when they look up fork, they're going to get the response showing this image URL. I can come back over it. There's my image. I can come over and maybe change this up. Maybe instead of fork, let's say I want to grab something like a ball. When I open this up, we get back a ball. All right, so now we have the ability to actually ping our information and grab a user, or excuse me, grab an image for our users. Now, this is assuming that everything works correctly. When working with APIs, you never want to assume that everything is going to work correctly, because a lot of this is maybe out of your control, right? Maybe some APIs become deprecated. So now I want to capture the exception as E, and I can return a response specifying all of the E arguments with a status of HTTP 500 internal server error, right? Because in this case, the user is not making an error. I am making an error within my code. So I want to make sure that my user knows, hey, this isn't your fault. This is my fault. So here's a 500 internal server error. Don't try to debug this. This isn't on you. It's on our side. All right, so let's try to break my code now. Let's say that we turn this back into icon instead of icons. And let's send the request. Well, now we just get non-type object is subscriptable. This doesn't really tell the user anything, and we probably don't want to give this to the user. So once we have something like, hey, debug is false, maybe that we change what type of error we get. Maybe we put it as something went wrong, and then we just give them a 500 internal server error. And then if debug is true, then developers can actually see the response coming in. They can see all the arguments, and they can try to debug what's going on within the code. Okay. And that's how we can interact with the Noun project. Does anyone have any questions over how we utilized all of the documentation that was provided to us to make a Django application with an API view that will leverage the API key and secret key provided by the Noun project, utilize auth to authenticate the user, leverage the endpoint that we found within the playground, utilize request to grab that content, load the content with JSON, grab the appropriate image, and return it to our user. All right, it doesn't seem like we have any questions. So the next question that we're going to cover is going to be, well, let me take a look here. This secret key and this API key, they're probably going to be unique to myself. If the API key is not unique, that secret key will definitely be unique to me. And that's what actually allows me to view how many times I've pinged the API. If I refresh this page, we can see that today I've made 8 calls. All right, here's my historical. It's telling it to me. I wonder if this is hourly. Yeah, so this is hourly. So it's telling me that I've made 8 calls within the last hour. But I do have a limit of 5,000 calls. So I want to protect my API key. All right, I don't want to round up costs for somebody else leveraging my information. Now, this is within a server, so it's not going to be exposed to the user. But where else can this be exposed? Where are we storing all of our code?
On GitHub.
Yeah, all of our code is being stored on GitHub, and GitHub is going to be a place, maybe we make this an open documentation, and people can actually view all of my code. And they would be able to see, oh, well, this is the secret key. I can just copy and paste that and use it in my own application, have this guy pay for all of the stuff that I'm doing. All right. So I want to actually hide this information. Well, how can I do that? Now, when we're hiding information, we're going to actually make a new file. So I'm going to run touch.env. Notice that this .env file automatically gets this little icon that's more of like a nut per se, or like a gear. And that's because it's recognizing it as, hey, this is part of the environment. We're going to utilize this to store environment variables. Well, here I can specify something like Django secret key. I can also specify something like debug mode. And this is where I'm going to handle how debug is being introduced within the environment. I can specify database configurations like database name and so on, which in this case, we're not going to dive into that. But more importantly, I can specify noun key. We're just call this API key. And we can call this noun secret key and store this below. Okay, so this Django secret key, we're going to actually find this within the projects. I'm going to come over to settings. And here's my Django secret key, which by practice, I'm just going to go ahead and store in here. Notice that I'm not putting any spaces between the variable establishment and the value that I'm storing. Do not put spaces in between these. For debug mode, I'm just going to simply ask it to be true. For my noun project API key, I'm going to grab this, come back over, and paste it. And then for my noun project secret key, I'm going to grab the following and paste it. All right. So now all of my secrets are being stored within this .env file. But it's still being recognized by Git. That's why it's in green. All right. So just moving the location, that doesn't mean that GitHub is not going to be tracking it. When I do git add, for example, if I run git status now, we can see that .env is part of what's being tracked by Git. So I would still be pushing it up to GitHub. So what's the point of even moving it to a new file? Well, you can tell Git exactly what to ignore within your project by making a .git ignore file. And in this .git ignore file, we can specify miscellaneous things like PyCache. All right, we don't want to have anything with PyCache being tracked. We already have a get ignore file at the very top of our demos and notes directory, and that's why there's no PyCache that's being tracked. For all of you, you may notice that when you were pushing code, your PyCache directory was being tracked. And typically when you're writing in Python, there's a whole file here that you don't want to, there's a whole series of files that you don't want to be pushed. So you could look up something like python.getignore file. If you look that up, here's a python.getignore that comes straight from GitHub, and it tells you all of the different things that you may not want to be tracked by GitHub that come from Python projects. All right, so there's my PyCache. I don't want any of that. And I also don't want it to track on my .env file. Okay, well, .env was there. Let's see what happens when I run git status now. Well, now when I run git status, it's recognizing I made a .getignore file, but .env is no longer being tracked by GitHub. So now GitHub won't be aware of the existence of this .env file. All right. Well, now let's connect the dots. I put everything within my .env file, but now I have errors where I don't have a secret key. I don't have something under debug, or I won't have something under debug. Let me find debug. There you go. In my views, I don't have anything for my API key or my secret key. So how do I get this all working and connect the dots? Well, this .env is actually just a file that's supposed to interact with your environment. For example, right now, if I say echo user, that should return Francisco Avila, right? Echo is the same as print, and this is recognizing the variable user. I can say something like hello and make that equal to hello Buffalo. And when I echo hello, you'll see hello Buffalo. Right? I'm simply storing variables. Well, right now, if I try to echo debug, I get nothing because debug doesn't exist. Well, let's see what happens when I run source.env. And then I run echo debug. Well, by running source.env, I'm saying I want you to load all of these environment variables into the current environment on my terminal. So now if I do echo debug, it actually returns true. So that's how it connects to Bash. But how does that connect to Django? Does that mean that I just have to do echo and then Django will be able to accept it? Well, we're actually going to utilize another library. We're going to go ahead and pip install python-.env. That's going to allow us to load this .env variable every time this project is running. And then we can reference it from our environment. Right, so I can come over to settings. Here I'll say from .env. I want to import load.env. I'm just going to execute that function. I want to load all of the environment variables within the .env file. This goes a little bit into pathing issues because .env is stored outside of the Poke API. But remember, everything in Python is in reference to the execution file. The file that is always being executed when I interact with Django is manage.py. And if I collapse everything, manage.py is a neighbor of .env. So when I specify this path here, it should be in reference from manage.py. All right. So now that loads the .env environment. This is essentially the same thing as running source.env within bash. Well, now I just need to interact with my environment to grab the appropriate variables. Well, I can say os.environ.get. So in my operating system, there is an environment, which is my terminal, and I want to get the following. I want to get the Django secret key. I can just copy that over. And I'm just gonna divide this over here. Okay, so I come back over, .get. Here's my Django secret key. All right, so os.environ. Environ is going to return all of your environment variables as a dictionary, which is going to have the key and value pairs. For debug, I'm going to do the same, but I'm going to actually utilize the eval function to turn this into true or false, rather than just the string of true or false. And I'll do os.environ.get debug. Finally, I'll come over to my views. Everything has already been loaded within settings, since settings is always the first file that gets executed after manage.py gets ran. So now I can just import OS. And I can specify os.environ.get. Here what we want is the noun API key. And then again, we go into os.environ.get, where what we're looking for is the noun secret key. Okay. Well, now we can do something to confirm that both of these exist. All right. Let's say if not self.api key or not self.secret key, and I want to raise an exception where the exception will say API keys are missing. All right, that will get caught within my exception and return as the argument. Let me quickly run this again. So Python manage.py run server. You'll see nothing has really changed. If I come back over to my noun project API, and let's change the request here. Let's change it for Wally. And we send that. So again, non-type object is not subscriptable. So it looks like Wally might have gotten an error, or actually, I don't think I ever fixed this from icon to icons. There you go. Wally comes back. We can open up the PNG file, and it looks like Wally is a wallet or a robot, one of the two. But there you go. Everything is present. If one of them were to be missing, for example, if I come back over to my .env, and let's say I take off this noun secret key, I'm going to crash my environment, run it again, execute it. I get API keys are missing. All right, because I'm currently missing my API key. All right. So let me just do a quick refresher over everything we did today. We created an API app. In this API app, we managed to connect URL patterns to a noun API view. This noun API view holds an API key and a secret key. We wrote a get method This get method will accept a variable from the URL pattern. It will check if our keys are present. If not, they'll raise an exception. It authenticates utilizing OAuth 1. We established our endpoint where we're including the variable that's being passed to the URL parameter. We then send a request, load the request content, which is a binary string, into some actual Python data. We iterate through said data to grab the appropriate information and return a response to the user. We handled our secret keys by placing them inside of a .env file and telling Git to ignore this .env file by establishing a .getignore file. Does anyone have any questions over anything that we've done up to this point in the lecture? All right, perfect. It doesn't look like we have any questions. Let me go ahead and stop our recording here before we go into part 2.